Welcome everyone to today's session of our Now program educational webinars. Today's topic will be clinical trials. This program is hosted by the Blum Resource Center. Over at the Blum, we are grateful to the Now team for this continued partnership. The recording of this session will be posted on our Blum YouTube playlist and our Blum Digital Resource Center. For those of you watching live, if you have any questions related to today's program, please feel free to utilize the chat and Q&A feature throughout the session. At the end of this session, your questions in the chat will be used to moderate our Q&A. If you have any other questions or would like more information about resources and programs offered through the Blum, please visit our website at www.dana-farber.org/resource-center or email us at blum_center@dfci.harvard.edu. Thank you all for joining us. I will now pass the workshop over to Dr. Gonzalez Castro to introduce our panelist.
Thank you, Sierra, and welcome everyone to a new Neuro-Oncology Wellness educational webinar. The Neuro-Oncology Wellness, or NOW program, is an initiative from the Center for Neuro-Oncology at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute with a mission to educate patients and their caregivers about brain tumors, as well as provide resources to promote overall health and well-being. My name is Nick Gonzalez Castro. I'm one of the neuro-oncologists here at Dana-Farber, and I serve as director of the NOW program. Thank you for joining us. We want you to be part of this conversation by submitting your questions via the Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom screen. And we will try to go over some of these questions towards the end of the program. Today, we're very lucky to have with us Dr. Patrick Wen, who is joining us for a discussion on brain tumor clinical trials. Dr. Wen is the director of the Center for Neuro-Oncology at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute and professor of neurology at Harvard Medical School. Dr. Wen is past president of the Society for Neuro-Oncology and previous editor of Neuro-Oncology, the premier academic journal in our field. He currently serves as chair of the Medical Advisory Board of the National Brain Tumor Society. More importantly, he has been caring for brain tumor patients for over 35 years and has led and participated in multiple neuro-oncology clinical trials, helping advance new therapies for our patients. Dr. Wen, thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Many of the patients that come to see us here at Dana-Farber at the Center for Neuro-Oncology are interested in clinical trials, so we thought it would be important to help provide more information about clinical trials so that patients are more familiar with these treatment options. Let's start at the beginning. What is a clinical trial?
It's really important for us to find better treatments for patients with brain tumors. And so clinical trials are crucial for that. They're research studies that try to define the safety and effectiveness of new therapies for patients with brain tumors.
And at what junctions during their history of the disease are patients eligible to participate in clinical trials? When should patients be, trying to learn more about these after a brain tumor diagnosis?
Although our treatments for brain tumors can be helpful because we need better treatments, at every juncture in their treatment, patients should consider clinical trials. And the National Comprehensive Cancer Network guidelines for cancer suggest that for brain tumors, and especially for gliomas, that the first choice should be to think about a clinical trial. That may not always work out, but patients should always think of it as an option to consider before perhaps going ahead with more standard treatments. So I think at diagnosis, after you've had your surgery and your doctors have told you what the diagnosis is, you should ask them that in addition to standard treatments, whether there are clinical trial options. Occasionally, there are clinical trial options after you finish standard treatments. And this is the case, for instance, with IDH-mutated gliomas, where after completing radiation and chemotherapy, there are now clinical trials using IDH inhibitors as maintenance therapy. And then perhaps the area where there are most clinical trials are at the time of recurrence, when standard therapies have stopped being helpful and the tumor is starting to grow. At that point, there are also a number of clinical trials. One of the things that's important to understand is that, especially in the recurrent situation, each time the tumor comes back, the clinical trial choices are diminished. And so the first time the tumor comes back is the time when you have the best chance of enrolling in a clinical trial and have the widest choice. And so before going ahead with standard therapies, you should discuss with your doctors whether a clinical trial makes sense or not.
Thank you for clarifying that and explaining, what instances patients can discuss clinical trial options. Patients often hear as well clinical trials being categorized in terms of phases, phase one, phase two, phase three. What do these phases refer to?
So when you have a new treatment that's shown promising results in the laboratory, you have to take it to patients in these clinical trials to find out if they're safe, to determine what's the proper dose to give to these patients, and also determine whether it's effective or not. So the first study that's done is a phase one study. This is the study to determine how safe the drug is and what is the best dose of the drug to give. So usually patients are exposed initially to a low dose of the drug so that there are not severe side effects that you encountered immediately. And then the doses gradually increase until you reach sometimes the maximum tolerated dose, or sometimes it's just a dose that's the maximum that you can administer. But these trials, these phase one trials will help us determine what is the right dose to give this drug. And it'll also determine the side effect profile so we understand what to look for going forwards. After you do the phase one study, you have a dose that you think is the right dose. Then often you would treat patients in a phase two trial with what you think is the proper dose. And there are different types of phase two trials. Sometimes they're just a single arm study where everybody in the study gets this dose of drug, and then you look to see how many patients respond to the treatment in terms of having shrinkage of the tumor and how long the tumor is stabilized. Sometimes the phase two trials are randomized, so it's compared to standard of care. And these phase two studies help us determine whether the drug has promise or not. And if the phase two study suggests that there is activity, then it goes forwards to a phase three trial. Phase three trials are the big studies that try to get FDA approval for this new treatment, and it's compared to standard of care. So you never get randomized against nothing because that wouldn't be ethical. So you're usually compared to standard of care. And these are large studies. They can be 1 or 200 patients to 700 or 800 patient studies. But when these studies are hopefully positive, then the FDA will approve the treatment and standard of care. So these were the studies that led to FDA approval of temozolomide for tumor treating fields or Optune, and also for Avastin or bevacizumab. In addition to these phase one, two, and three trials, there's also a type of trial that you'll hear more and more often called phase zero, or window of opportunity trials. One of the challenges in developing new treatments for patients with brain tumors is that we don't know how well these drugs actually get into the brain, how well they pass through the blood-brain barrier to get into the tumor, and whether they're impacting the molecular pathways or the immune system that we are hoping they will. So once we know this recommended phase two dose, some patients are given the drug before surgery. These are patients who need to have surgery. So they're given the drug before surgery, and then some time afterwards, in terms of days or a couple of weeks, the patient goes to surgery to have the tumor taken out. And then you can measure the drug concentration in the tumor to see how much actually gets in. And also you can look at the molecular pathways or the immune response to see if the drug is doing what it's supposed to do. And these phase zero or window of opportunity surgical trials are really important because if the drug doesn't get in and it doesn't block the pathway we want, then it's never going to be useful. And so we don't want to expose patients to this drug unless we know that it's doing what it's supposed to be doing. And so going forwards, there's going to be a lot more of these types of phase zero or window of opportunity surgical trials.
Thank you for clarifying that and explaining. So phase one, trying to look at safety, maybe a dozen or 20 patients or so. Phase two, looking for activity, response, maybe 40, 50 patients perhaps. And then phase three, looking really if this is better than the standard treatment, studies that are large, hundreds of patients. And also the phase zero studies, where we look for activity in the brain tumor itself that is recovered after surgery. Other terms
Actually,
that
I forgot to mention one thing. Uh, Patients often, when they talk to their doctors about trials, they'll be told, "Oh, we don't have slots right now." And especially for phase one studies, because we have to make sure each dose is safe, we usually treat only a small number of patients at a time. So often it's three patients. So three patients will go in the study, and then we will watch them for a month or two and to make sure it's safe before we add more patients or increase the dose. And during that time when we're watching the patient, we can't enroll another patient. And so that's the time when the slots may not be available.
Thank you. Thank you for clarifying that. Yes. It's as we alluded to, trials are in a way experiments, studies that are designed in a certain way to have only a certain number of patients at each instance. Other terms that are mentioned when we discuss clinical trials are randomization, blinding, control arms. You alluded to some of these, but can you clarify these for our viewers?
Ultimately, when you have a new treatment, you want to see if the new treatment is better or not compared to standard of care. And so either in phase two studies or in phase three studies, these trials are often randomized. But when that happens, when you join the trial, um, you are put into one arm or the other by chance. So you could be put into the arm that has the experimental drug, or you could be put into the arm that has standard of care. And so this is a random process. It's generated by a computer. And so we don't have control over that. Sometimes in the control arm, there is a placebo. There's never, it's very rare for there to be no treatment, but occasionally there can be no treatment if it's thought to be safe to do that. And in the control arm, there may be a drug that's not active, and that's compared to the experimental treatment under consideration. So recently, last year, there was a drug called vorasidenib that was FDA approved for IDH mutated grade 2 gliomas. These were in patients who had surgery but were felt not to need immediate treatment with radiation and chemotherapy. And so one option would have been that they could have been just watched. And so in that trial, patients were randomized to vorasidenib or placebo, and patients were closely observed and to see if the vorasidenib did better than patients receiving placebo, or basically patients receiving no treatment. When patients progressed on the placebo arm in that particular trial, they were given the option to take the vorasidenib. So patients eventually were able to get vorasidenib, even if they were randomized to the placebo arm. But that's one of the very rare trials where there is only placebo. Most trials in neuro-oncology, the control arm is just standard of care, usually radiochemotherapy in patients who are newly diagnosed, and lomustine or similar treatments in recurrent tumors.
Once patients are randomized to one of the two arms, do they know what treatment they're receiving? And would you know as the investigator leading the study?
Most trials you would know. So you would get radiation and temozolomide chemotherapy or radiation and PCV chemotherapy in the control arm, and you would get your experimental drug, usually with radiation and often with temozolomide chemotherapy in the experimental arm. There are rare occasions when you don't know. So I mentioned the vorasidenib trial, uh, where everybody got pills, but half the patients got vorasidenib and the other half got placebo. There is another trial that we're waiting the results on, looking at a vaccine called Cevaxum. So in this study, patients with glioblastoma were treated with radiation and chemotherapy. And then after they finished radiation, they were randomized to temozolomide and the vaccine, or temozolomide and placebo. And so in that particular trial, we didn't know whether patients were getting the vaccine or the placebo.
I see. Very interesting. And this is related also to the fact that we really don't know about the results. Often when we discuss trials with patients, patients want to know of all the different options, which are the ones that are most promising. Why don't you discuss, what information is available to you as the trial is ongoing?
I think if we knew which was the best trial for each patient, we would just advise them to do that trial because, of course, we all want the best for the patient. A lot of times we really don't know which trial is the best. Sometimes theoretically, and the earlier scientific evidence would suggest one trial has a higher chance of being helpful than another, and then we would advise the patients that way. I think the other things that come into the decision on which trial to choose are the side effects, because some drugs have relatively few side effects, but some drugs have a lot of side effects. And these will be disclosed to you when your doctor discusses the trials. And that's an important aspect to base your decision on. And then the third component is how difficult it is to do the trial. Because some trials you just take a pill every day. So vorasidenib was a very easy trial because patients just took one pill every day. And the recently approved dordaviprone for diffuse midline gliomas, you just took pills once a week. So it was very easy. But there are some drugs where you have to get injections once a week or even infusions twice a week. And that becomes very challenging. So if you live far away from the treating center, each of these trips becomes a significant part of your life. So those are things that also needs to be taken into consideration.
Another question is about prior treatments and how those can impact the ability to participate. So, for example, if a patient received radiation and chemotherapy, how long, and we review the MRI and we see evidence of possible disease progression, how long do patients need to wait since the most recent treatment to be able to participate in a clinical trial?
So there are two considerations. One is just safety. If you've just received chemotherapy, like temozolomide, for instance, you have to wait usually 3 to 4 weeks to make sure your blood counts are okay before it's safe to do another study. But with the combination of radiation and chemotherapy, there is a phenomenon called pseudoprogression. So the radiation uh, tries to kill the tumor cells, but it's also damaging all the blood vessels in that area. So the blood vessels are very leaky for several months after completion of radiotherapy. And so the scans can look worse especially in the first 3 months after radiotherapy. And it's very hard to separate this change, which is due to the effects of the radiation, from the tumor that's growing. And so this phenomenon called pseudoprogression lasts 3 months, but can also last even longer. So the scans will look worse, and then over time they'll stabilize, and then they'll get better. And because of this phenomenon, most trials for recurrent disease exclude patients in the first 3 months after radiotherapy, so that it doesn't confuse patients who have pseudoprogression from enrolling into these studies.
Thank you for explaining that. Two important considerations. Another consideration that comes up is a financial one. Patients ask, are the treatments that are being offered in the clinical trial covered by insurance or through other mechanisms? And then about, the fact of having to receive treatments here at Dana-Farber versus receiving them other places. What can you comment on that?
So that's a very important part of this. So usually trials don't result in an increased cost to patients in terms of the actual treatments and the visits. The trial drug and the extra tests that are done as part of the trial are covered by the trial. The patient visits, the MRIs and routine blood work, which you would normally do if you were doing standard of care, is usually covered by insurance. And most at Dana-Farber, patients' insurance are screened to make sure that there are no issues with these extra costs. Some trials do require you to come more often. And so the travel and the time, those are also important. And that isn't usually covered by the trial. And most cancer trials, there's no payment to the patient to take part in the trial. And so there can be some financial impact if you have to travel, especially long distances, to enroll in a trial. But increasingly, we're trying to make trials a little bit more friendly so that you can have more and more of your care closer to home. So for instance, many of the glioblastoma trials now allow the radiotherapy to be done closer to where the patient lives. So you don't have to come into Boston to Dana-Farber or Brigham and Women's to have the radiotherapy. But there are still extra visits that may be involved.
Let's imagine now the scenario of a patient that enrolls in a clinical trial, started on treatment. How do we determine if the treatment is really helping the patient? How do we assess response?
So when you're in a clinical trial, you watch very closely, both in terms of blood work, in terms of visits or calls to make sure you're doing okay. And then usually patients will get MRI scans anywhere from 6 to 8 weeks, or sometimes a little longer, depending on the type of tumor. But you're monitored very closely. And if there's any evidence that the experimental treatment is not helping you, then we want to stop it and have you go on something else. Because the whole goal of this is to find something that will be helping you. So we don't want you to be on any treatment that's not helpful. The other aspect of any experimental treatment are the side effects. So it's important that the treatment is not causing such bad side effects that it becomes either dangerous to continue on the treatment or that it could cause some longer term harm. And so patients will come off trials if it's not helping and the tumor is growing, based usually on MRI scans, but sometimes on symptoms. But they can also come off if the treatment is causing too many side effects and it's not safe to continue with the treatment. The other thing that's important about trials is that at any time the patient has the right to drop out of the trial. You could sign consent and say, I don't want to do it the next second. But at any time throughout the whole process, if you think it's becoming too difficult or too uncomfortable, you have the right to just drop out at any time.
Yeah, thank you for highlighting that. And that is true. Patients are in control, and if they decide not to continue participating for any reason, it is okay, and it doesn't have any impact on the relationship with the provider. We're just trying to help you with, whatever standard or experimental treatment is available, but, the ultimate decision rests with the patient. Um, if if a patient, let's imagine now a scenario that might happen. Let's say a trial is run. Unfortunately, many patients don't respond to treatment, but there are a few patients that are responding to the treatment and remain stable with no changes on their imaging. Can those patients continue on the treatment offered by the trial, even if the trial is closed or has closed?
I think it's important that patients have access to those drugs if it's helping them. And so most of the time, it's possible, even if the trial is closed, to continue on the drug. There are different mechanisms to make that happen. Sometimes we just keep the study open for as long as there's patients on the trial. Sometimes, if the drug is FDA approved, the company will allow the patient to get access to the drug outside of the protocol. Very rarely, the drug is no longer being developed, and then the drug supply may eventually be exhausted.
Mm.
And so we have a trial with an old IDH inhibitor that has been helpful for some patients, but the drug has not been developed for, I think, 5 or 6 years or possibly more. And so this coming year, the drug supply will be exhausted. That's a rare situation, and it's not at all ideal because ethically we want to be able to give patients the drug for as long as it's helping them. Fortunately, there's another IDH inhibitor, vorasidenib, that got FDA approved,
Yeah.
and so these patients will be able to go on to vorasidenib.
There could be an alternative. Can you comment on the therapeutic modalities? You alluded to some of them, but can you comment on, targeted therapy and immunotherapy and different therapeutic modalities that are being evaluated now, and perhaps discuss what are the trial options that we currently, as of November 2025, available for glioblastoma here at Dana-Farber?
So the standard therapy for glioblastoma is radiation daily, 5 days a week for 6 weeks with a low dose of chemotherapy, temozolomide during that time. And then after a month break, the patients get the temozolomide at a higher dose for 5 days in a row every 28 days for 6 cycles. And some patients choose to use a device called Optune as well. So that's standard therapy. So there are trials that try to enhance standard therapy as well as try to attack the tumor in more novel ways. So radiation is a really important part of the treatment for glioblastoma, but the tumor cells learn sometimes to repair the damage from the radiation and survive the radiation treatment. And so the tumor comes back despite radiotherapy. So we, as part of a large international trial called GBM-AGIL, the newest arm is a drug called AZD1390 that blocks some of these DNA repair pathways. And so in the phase 1 study that we did, it showed that the drug is safe and it can help the radiation work better. And so we have a study that's about to open, adding this drug to radiotherapy to help the radiotherapy work better. The temozolomide chemotherapy that we use in almost every patient with glioblastoma really only works in the 40% of patients that have a methylated MGMT promoter. In that situation, the chemotherapy can damage the DNA and kill the tumor cells. If the tumor has an unmethylated MGMT promoter, the tumor has this repair protein that repairs the damage. And so those patients are not very sensitive to temozolomide. And so we have a chemotherapy that is not affected by MGMT. It doesn't have an easy name, but it's called QBS 10072S. And so this drug is engineered to get into the tumor and to kill tumor cells, even in patients with unmethylated MGMT. And so that trial is ongoing. There are other more novel approaches. So we have a number of studies with targeted drugs. Some of these drugs affect specific molecular pathways. One drug that we have in trials with glioblastoma is a drug called troriluzole. One of the major findings in recent years is that the nerve cells in our brains, the neurons, interact with the tumor cells and help the tumor cells to grow. And these nerve cells, these neurons, form connections with the tumor cells called synapses. And so drugs that can block this connection potentially can slow tumor growth. And so this drug, troriluzole, is thought to do that. And we have a trial of that that's ongoing. There's also a lot of interest in immunotherapies through various approaches. There's a lot of interest in vaccines. And I mentioned earlier that we recently completed a multi-center trial with a survivin vaccine. Perhaps the major trial we have at Dana-Farber is a very innovative vaccine called Neovax. Here, the patient's tumor taken at surgery undergoes very extensive genetic testing, and we find 10 to 20 molecular changes in the tumor that can stimulate the immune system. And a personalized vaccine is made for each. This vaccine is combined with an immunotherapy drug called pembrolizumab or Keytruda. And so patients, they get the tumor sequence, they get the vaccine made, and then they're given the vaccine at regular intervals to boost the immune response against the tumor. And then this is coupled with infusions with the pembrolizumab to augment the immune response. Another approach are viral therapies. So there's been a lot of interest in the past with oncolytic viruses. These were initially engineered to grow through the tumor, to kill the tumor cells, which it can do. But it turns out that these viruses are also very irritating. So they can stimulate a very potent immune response in the tumor. And so giving them is, in some ways, a form of immunotherapy. And so we have a trial that's led by Dr. Chioka, the chair of neurosurgery, where you inject the virus into the tumor, but not just once, as most viral therapies have been doing, but up to 6 times in the hopes that multiple treatments will be more effective. And then there's a lot of interest in what's called bispecific antibodies. These are drawing both the tumor cells and immune cells, putting the immune cells in close contact with the tumor. And there are plans for CAR T cells in the next year or so also. So there's a lot of different approaches that are being looked at for glioblastoma. Some of them are at diagnosis, and many of them are in the recurrent situation when the tumor has started to grow back despite standard therapy.
Thank you for that wonderful overview of different treatment modalities that are being studied for glioblastoma. You alluded to IDH mutant gliomas. Can you briefly just tell us, what's in the portfolio for the treatment of those tumors?
I think one of the major advances in this treatment of gliomas has been the realization that many or most of the lower grade gliomas have IDH mutations. This is an early molecular change in the tumor that causes the tumor to grow and cause trouble. And now there have been a number of IDH inhibitors that have been developed. And so it's on its own, in a study called the Indigo trial that we helped run, it showed that vorasidenib was very effective in slowing the growth of these tumors. And so that resulted in vorasidenib being FDA approved. But we also want to know whether adding vorasidenib to radiation and chemotherapy would be helpful. So we have a trial that will start early 2026. It's going to be a national trial run by the Alliance Cooperative Group, where we give patients radiation, and then when they're getting the monthly temozolomide for grade 3 astrocytoma, we add the vorasidenib to see if it's helpful. We also have another trial with a different IDH inhibitor called safusidenib. Here, patients who need radiation and chemotherapy complete their course of treatment. And then instead of just watching them with no treatment, patients will be randomized to this IDH inhibitor, safusidenib, or placebo. These are for newly diagnosed tumors. In the recurrent setting, when the tumors have come back after standard treatment, we also have trials looking to see if we can augment the immune response in these tumors. In IDH mutated gliomas, the immune system is suppressed. And when you give an IDH inhibitor, you can improve the immune response to the tumor. And so we have a trial combining vorasidenib with pembrolizumab, the checkpoint inhibitor. And then the final area are the relatively rare tumors. These are the grade 4 astrocytomas that until 2021 was not really an entity. So we have a trial combining radiation, temozolomide chemotherapy, and vorasidenib for these tumors. And there are plans for a big randomized trial for that group of patients.
Thank you again for a wonderful overview on clinical trials. Are there any take-home points that you would like to leave for our viewers?
I think clinical trials are really crucial for developing better treatments. And in recent years, there has been real progress, but there's still work to be done. I think for patients with brain tumors, and especially gliomas, it's important to talk to your doctor to see if clinical trials are an option for you and whether it's a good fit. But also joining clinical trials is a really noble thing. It allows you to help everyone else with the same problem. And with these clinical trials, we hope to improve the outcomes for everybody and eventually come one day to have cures for all these brain tumors.
Thank you so much again, Dr. Wen. This is a lot of very valuable information, and I trust that many of our patients will benefit from hearing your thoughts and those that will watch this online on our YouTube channel. So thank you so much again. And thank you everyone for joining today. And we look forward to seeing you again at a subsequent Now webinar. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you both for presenting today. We so appreciate it. And please keep an eye out soon to our audience for the posting of this on our Blum YouTube playlist. Thank you both.
Thank you, Sierra.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye now.